Program was pretty well put together by Steve Michelson. He spent a lot of time researching Grover Broadfoot, and he came up with some pretty interesting things. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Well, before I begin, I want to introduce some special people that are here tonight. We have members of the Broadfoot family here tonight. If you folks want to stand up. We've got Candy Severson and her mother, Grover's niece. That's right.
And I'm Tammy Broadfoot Holden. I'm Grover's granddaughter.
I'm Scott Broadfoot, Grover's grandson, eldest grandson.
So we're glad to have you here tonight. And I have to thank them because I got a lot of pictures and stuff from those folks to help to make the presentation. And then we also have Randy Morey here tonight. I'm getting feedback here. And Randy's going to share some stuff later on when I finish here. He's got some thoughts or things we remember that he's going to share with us as well. And I'm going to multitask tonight because I have to talk and do the point or do this. So we'll see what happens with that. So. I'm going to begin with a poem that was written for an event very similar to this one 46 years ago, and we'll go on from there. This hour retrieves an aura from the past, a prelude that has come full circle here. For him we feed with accolades of love. We share these warm appraisals of his worth. With pride, acknowledging his high estate, he grasps the help and stock that courage lends to men of will and scaled the crest success. He has identified himself with truth, judging all men proportionately fair. Astutely sensing subterfuge and fraud, he is a man of quiet dignity, whose role of office suits him very well. He has an unassuming mien and takes a thought of home, though he may be afar, to keep old friendships ever in his heart. Like I said, this poem was written 46 years ago for an event similar to this one tonight. On March 1st, 1962, the citizens of Mondovi gathered at Sacred Heart Church to honor one of their sons, Grover Broadfoot, who would become Chief Justice of the Wisconsin State Supreme Court that previous January. That evening, his many friends and neighbors of this community spoke of the high regard they held for this man who, despite his success, never forgot his roots in Mondovi and always considered the city his home. Reverend A.G. Heemer probably summed it up best how people felt about Grover Broadfoot when he told those present, "We in this community are highly honored to have Grover as our friend and neighbor. We are proud of him. He has accomplished a great deal, rendered great services to the city, county, and state." And so tonight, 46 years later, we're going to look at how this man, who has been described variously as plain-spoken, unpretentious, modest, ordinary, quiet voice, unruffled, down-to-earth, and a man of humility and common sense, rose to the pinnacle of his profession. Grover Broadfoot was born December 27, 1892, in Independence, Wisconsin, to Dr. Alexander and Celia Tillotson Broadfoot. In 1893, Dr. Broadfoot moved his family and medical practice to Mondovi, where he established a partnership with Dr. Charles Everett, one of the earlier doctors in Mondovi, and there you get an idea what Mondovi looked like when the Broadforts moved to town. And just as kind of an aside, his office that he had, stands were subway stands now on the corner there. It was an earlier Hellweek's department store before they built the farmer store, where the farmer store was. For those Mondovi people who don't know what I'm talking about. In addition to Grover, the Broadfoots had 7 other children: Marion, Grace, James, Roscoe, Grover, Hibbard, Francis, and Doris. And there's a picture of the family. Oops. Like I said, I'm multitasking tonight. So. And here's this is a picture of Grover and one of his brothers probably on Eau Claire Street. You can kind of see, I think that sign that's kind of hanging over there is right on the corner, or on the 4 corners where the insurance office is right now. And probably kind of right on the 4 corners there. They're kind of in the middle of the block. Grover's on the left. Oops. And that's where Grover's mother lived, and that house actually is still standing in town. I was confused at first because it looks different, but it's just over here on the corner of Jackson and Main, across from Central Lutheran. And I'm not sure if that's where he grew up or not, but that was her home. Alexander actually died in 1804, so he left Celia to care for all these kids. And I understand from reading some things that occasionally she would, to meet expenses and cover expenses, she would farm the kids out to other families, as they say. And for several years, she operated a store in town as well. And they are actually, Alexander and Celia are buried in the Gelmanton Cemetery. So if you go down there, you can see their grave. It's on right on the nearest, when you come right out of Gelmanton in the first driveway. Grover Broadfoot, growing up in Mondovi, attended the schools here in town. And there you can see old Mondovi High School at the Wheelan building next door. And like many young men, he was interested in sports. And you can see here the 1909 Mondovi High School baseball team where he was the manager. He's sitting in the front there with the bats. In later years, Grover would serve as the manager of the city team, and there's a story about that I'll share a little later. According to Dr. Roy Lee's old-timer report, he also liked to swim, and on hot summer days, he could be seen floating in Muir Lake all day. And I understand he also was a pretty good fisherman too, from what talking to his son John told me. Grover graduated from the Mondovi High School class of 1909. There's the class. Among his classmates were Harry Dillon, John Dillon, Edna Claflin, Myrtle Trowbridge, Reed Kenyon, and his best friend is John Berg. And John Berg is on the right of the picture. You can see him, the taller person. And I know most of you know John Berg, or remember John Berg. After his graduation, Grover enrolled in a business college and worked as a stenographer in Omaha for a time. And his employer out there had encouraged him he should be a lawyer, that he should be going to law. So in 1912, he returned home and enrolled in the University of Wisconsin. And while attending the university there, he served as editor of the yearbook, which was a big job at that, and kind of an honor to get that job. And then he also worked as a bellhop, and he worked as an assistant in one of the Madison newspapers. Oops, I'm going backwards here. And in 1918, he graduated from and received his law degree. As this was the time of World War I, though, he did enlist in the Army after he graduated. And here you can see him with his two brothers who also enlisted. Upon his discharge from the Army, he returned to Mondovi to set up his law practice. His first partner was Schuyler Gilman. And Schuyler himself was pretty prominent in his day. He was mayor of Mondovi for a lot of years in the first maybe couple decades of the 20th century, in the 1900s. He ran for office himself, he ran for Congress at one time. And if you drive around Mondovi and you see all the nice wide paved streets, you can thank Schuyler. He was a big believer in public works. So he was a character in his own day as well. For much of Grover's law career in Mondovi, he had his office actually in the state bank. And I think it was probably those last doors, or actually, Randy, you would know where his office was, you had it. Which door, do you know which one it was?
Which door?
Way on the back.
Way in the back, okay, that's what we thought. Having established his law practice, Grover Broadfoot began his career in public service when he was elected Buffalo County District Attorney in 1922. Here you see the old courthouse in Elmore that he would have been in use at his time. First case he prosecuted as district attorney was actually a murder case. A man by the name of Enos Boehner killed the Elma City Marshal, John Gattenbean, and the Marshal's son in one of the local saloons. The case at the time drew a lot of attention. They had a lot of lawyers from La Crosse came up. They were going to help with the defense, and it was quite the affair. In reporting on the trial, the Buffalo County Journal, in its March 1st, 1923 edition, said of Grover Broadfoot, "Our young district attorney, Grover Broadfoot, made an excellent impression in his first appearance before a jury on a criminal course in this case. His argument was a masterly discussion of the evidence and was thoroughly fair and dignified in every respect, and refreshingly free from language abusing either witnesses or opposing attorneys." Boehner was acquitted in the murder of the marshal, but was convicted for the killing of the marshal's son. It was interesting that during his time as district attorney, it was also a time of Prohibition. And well, Kelly back there, he knows, we spent some time looking through old case files from that time period. And Grover spent a lot of time issuing search warrants and prosecuting people for having illegal stills. And my favorite case from that time was a case that took place down in the town of Lincoln. There was a farmer down there, somebody who had a still, and it was just creating a whole lot of commotion. There were people coming all hours of the day and night and to get their moonshine, and some were coming drunk, some were leaving drunk, and the neighbors were getting all upset about it. And so finally, a couple of men in the area were deputized. I think it's a little bit different than they would do now. They deputized a couple of the neighbors to go check it out and get the evidence so they could shut it down and read the deposition, and they're going to be asked questions. Grover's asking them questions, and finally he asked them, well, how are you able to identify the still? And they said, oh, we do that by how it smelled. So I think they had experience. This is also the time of the Great Depression as well when he was DA. And so he had to do a lot of the cases where the parents weren't able to care for their children. They didn't have the money to do it. And you read some of those depositions, and again, they're really they're heartbreaking. As DA, Broadfoot tried to treat everyone fairly. In one case, a young man had fallen in with the wrong crowd, got in trouble, and was facing prison time. The father wrote to Broadfoot asking him to let his son off because he really was a good kid and he was needed on the farm. And Grover Broadfoot wrote back to say, well, the son had done wrong and had to be punished, but he promised that if he behaved himself while he was in prison, he would see to it that the young man would be released in 6 months. And true to his word, he wrote to the prison. Grover Broadfoot wrote to the prison authorities 6 months later asking that the young man be sent home. Grover Broadfoot served as DA actually until 1935. From 1923 to 1935, he was the DA in Buffalo County. It was also during the 1920s and 30s that Grover Broadfoot settled into the life of a small-town country lawyer. In talking to Gary Schlossstein about this period, he pointed out that unlike most lawyers today, the country lawyer of Grover's period often practiced alone or perhaps with one partner. In Grover's case, he first partnered with Schuyler Gilman and later with Ed Larkin, who some of you probably knew. Also, according to Gary, in those days, the small-town lawyer functioned as a general practitioner and handled a variety of cases. They served as business advisors and counselors to their clientele. They filled out people's tax returns, helped with land deals, helped farmers fill out the form for gas tax refunds, and they handled divorces and cases like that. They received about $3 for filling out a deed. In comment at this time too, I got a letter from Randy Morey talking about it, and he said oftentimes in a small town, the small town lawyer often was involved with both sides of a dispute. So they might have a problem, they might just go say, well, let's see Grover about it. And so sometimes he probably acted more as a mediator between people and to settle their disputes. This is also a time when lawyers and doctors didn't necessarily make a lot of money. And John Broadfoot, Grover's son, talked to me about that. And he said he remembers that on Saturday nights, his father and Doc Johnson, which would be old Doc Johnson, I guess, I don't know that, I knew young Dr. Johnson. Ben John, thank you. They'd sit on a bench in front of John Berg's drugstore, and they would talk about the events of the week and the day. And in the meantime, all the different farmers and stuff would come up to them, and townspeople would come up to them. They might hand the doc a quarter, they might give Grover produce, things of that nature. And that was really how, in a lot of ways, they were compensated back then. Although Grover and his contemporaries worked hard, they also took time to have fun as well. As mentioned earlier, Grover Broadfoot served as the manager of the city baseball teams. And one of the stories he used to delight in telling was of a trip the team took to Mishawaka. On the way home, they decided they were going to acquire some watermelons. And while they were in the watermelon patch, a car drove up and stopped. The driver kept his lights on and got out of the car and hollered, "Don't move it, put your hands up." Well, they all got pretty scared until they found out it was John Berg. So we think of these older generations as being so serious, but they too like to have a good time. And Grover served as manager of the team until it was decided they were going to hire a ringer as a pitcher and actually pay the pitcher, and he decided he didn't want to have any part of that, and he quit. So it was also during these years that Grover Broadfoot's personal life took shape. On December 29th, 1925, he married Margaret Jacobi of Mondovi, and they would have one son, John. According to some who knew him, Grover was somewhat more of a quiet person, where Margaret was a little more talkative of the two. I think Donnie, you told me that? Yeah. In 1940, the Broadfoots purchased this house on Hudson Street, where Joel Smith lives now. And these are, they actually lived in a house prior to that, directly behind, and I couldn't quite figure out where that house was, whether there was a house directly behind there at one time, I guess. Okay. Is that there anymore? It's still there? Okay. And just here's a couple of pictures of Margaret Broadfoot and Grover and Margaret from that time period. In 1939, Grover Broadfoot took his first step onto the stage of statewide politics when he was appointed by Governor Julius Heil to the newly created State Board of Tax Appeals. He was recommended for this appointment by one of the governor's advisors, Elmer Barlow of Arcadia, who was a friend of Grover's. Barlow, he was a Trumbull County lawyer, had served as DA of that county, and had played a role in the rural electrification in the 1930s, and had gotten to know Grover quite well. Later, Grover Broadfoot will actually be appointed to succeed him on the state Supreme Court. The board that Grover was appointed to was created for the purpose of reviewing appeals taken by private citizens or corporations on tax assessments by the Department of Taxation. And Broadfoot would serve on that until 1943, and ultimately served as the board's chairman. During that period too, sometime in the early 1940s, this is a story that John Broadfoot told me, Governor Heil decided to come to Mondovi to give a speech. And Elmer Barlow asked Grover Broadfoot to write something appropriate for the governor to say while he was in town. It was quite a show when the governor arrived in Mondovi. He came roaring into town in a big black limousine driven by a state trooper, and did a big U-turn in front of the four corners in front of the Putzir building, or the Mangy Moose, or what we call it today, and hopped out of the car and proceeded to give the speech that Grover had written. However, the governor ad-libbed a bit, and he threw in some hells and some dams. And that did sit to Al Grover, and when he got home that night, he called Elmer Barlow and said that was the last speech he would write for the governor. After serving as city attorney for several years, Grover Broadfoot ran and defeated Kearney Jacobson for mayor of Mondovi in April 1943, and Kearney would actually go on later on to be mayor in later years. His time as mayor, there you can see the ballot, Grover versus Kearney. And that gives you an idea what Mondovi City building looked like about in that time period as well. Looks a lot different now, same building, looks different. His time as mayor took place during World War II, and much of the mayor's and city council's time was spent planning for the post-war period. Some of the aldermen who served in the council during this period are Willard Cummings, George Schaefer, Lenny Larson, Evan Evenson, Ed Olofsson, and Clayton Wolf. The council also seemed to spend a lot of time reading Mondovi Herald accounts, dealing with tavern issues during this period. At one meeting in May 1943, tavern owners were called before the council to be lectured by Mayor Broadfoot. He told them that many complaints have been made since I have taken office about the way your business is conducted. The main complaint is the fact that minors are permitted to enter taverns. I have seen people entering taverns that did not look 21 years of age. If complaints are made and can be proven, applications will be placed on file for proceeding a revocation of that license. So he could lay down the law too. As the war ended and the GIs returned, Mondovi was faced with an acute housing shortage. The Land O'Lakes plant, for instance, had opened in 1945, and workers there had trouble finding suitable housing for their families. There were articles in the Mondovi Herald urging residents to open up their homes to people in need of housing. It was during Broadfoot's time as mayor that the Mondovi we know today began to take shape. To address the housing shortage, areas of the city were opened up for construction. It was at this time, for example, that Parker Avenue and North Washington Street began to be developed. So you can kind of start seeing the general outlines of Mondovi. Mayor Broadfoot was concerned that the new lots in town be priced reasonably for returning GIs. In the spring of 1944, Grover Broadfoot announced that he was a candidate in the Republican primary for state senate. His main opponent in the race was Warren Knowles. Knowles, who was better known than Broadfoot, won the primary, and later on Warren Knowles would go on to become governor in the 1960s. So it makes you wonder what would have happened had Grover won that primary and not Warren Knowles. All was not lost for Grover Broadfoot, however, because when the Republican candidate for the state assembly district for Buffalo County and Pepin County died, the party turned to Grover, and he was elected to the assembly, instead of the Senate, he was elected to the assembly that November. In the state assembly, Broadfoot was quickly recognized as a leader of the lower house. He became a member of the Republican Steering Committee and the Legislative Council. These two groups set the agenda for the rest of the assembly. Because of his work on the State Board of Tax Appeals, Broadfoot was regarded as the foremost expert on taxes in the legislature. As a result, he was given the task of chairing a committee that was charged with overhauling the tax system in Wisconsin. Over the years, the tax system had become just a hodgepodge of laws that often were contradictory and they were hard to understand. And his committee was to study the situation and make recommendations on how to clean it up. Grover Broadfoot was also concerned about the role lobbyists played in Madison. He worked on a bill that would have required lobbyists to file weekly expenditure reports and account for every penny that they were spending. The bill, however, never made it out of committee. John Broadfoot recalled that during the time that his father was in the legislature, the paper pen company handed out free pens to the legislatures, and the Madison movie theaters offered free passes for them, but Grover wouldn't accept the gifts because he didn't want to be beholden to anyone. One bill that Broadfoot did write and get passed through the legislature was one that created a state board of alcohol studies. At the time, problem drinkers were either put in jail or in mental hospitals and not treated for their problem. Broadfoot's bill called for funds to be taken from the tax on liquor to finance studies and to establish treatment facilities. In testifying for the bill, Broadfoot said that proper treatment could save the average community many times what it would lose in liquor tax money, and that imprisonment was not the answer. Later on in 1950, it was reported that more than half the people admitted to the programs that were made possible by this bill experienced success in dealing with their alcohol problems. While serving in the legislature, Grover Broadfoot also maintained his law practice in Mondovi. And this is a story that John Broadfoot told me, and he tells it a lot better than I do, so I'm going to try. In 1947, Grover Broadfoot took the Mondovi Equity as a client. A state auditor from the State Board of Taxation accused the equity of misrepresenting how much fuel it sold. And Grover went out and found a mathematician in Red Wing who drew up tables for different types of gas to show how the volume of gas contracted or expanded over the course of a year. And he took the case primarily because Grover took the case primarily because he didn't like the idea that some bureaucrat in Madison was setting all these rules for the local companies. Well, in the midst of the case, Broadfoot was appointed Attorney General. And after the first day he came in office, the Justice Department lawyer that was prosecuting the case came and talked to him about it, and Grover said, well, I don't think you have a case, but go have at it anyway, we'll see what happens. The case eventually went to the Supreme Court after Broadfoot was appointed to the court, and he recused himself from the case, but he basically saw three sides of it as defense attorney, prosecutor, and ultimately on the court. When Governor Oscar Rennebaum decided to appoint Wisconsin Attorney General John Martin to the state Supreme Court in June 1948, he turned to Grover Broadfoot to fill the vacancy in the Attorney General's office. The appointment came somewhat as a surprise to many. Although he had a good record in the legislature, he was not that well known. And how was it that a second-term state representative from western Wisconsin was picked for this important job? While talking to John Broadfoot about it, he speculated that John Berg might have played a role. Before entering politics, Governor Rennebaum was a pharmacist and had served on the State Board of Pharmacology with John Berg. And so it's possible that John had talked to the governor at the time that someone from western Wisconsin got an important job in Madison. Although I'm sure, Grover Broad got it on his own merits too, because he was seen as a leader in the legislature and actually made a name for himself in the state legislature. 1948 was an election year, and as soon as he took office, Broadfoot had to prepare to run in the September primary. He didn't have a long time to get his name established. This frustration came through in a postscript to a letter he wrote to a young man who had written the Attorney General about an election issue. P.S. As an otherwise astute young man, you ought to keep closer tabs on politics at the state level. Your letter was addressed to Attorney General John Martin. Now, I don't suppose that many people know that I was appointed to the office of Attorney General, but I thought everybody knew that Mr. Martin had been elevated to the Supreme Court. Grover did lose that primary race that September to a man from Milwaukee named Donald Martin, who was actually a relative of John Martin, and voters being what they were, they thought they were voting for John Martin, because John Martin actually had been Attorney General for quite a few years. But it wasn't very popular, though. After Donald Martin had won, all the Republican lawyers in the state and all the more conservative newspapers actually backed the Democratic candidate. That wasn't supposed to happen. There was some talk in the newspapers after the primary that one reason Grover Broadfoot lost the primary was because more of the leaders in the Republican Party focused all their energies on making sure that Governor Rennebaum won his primary race, and Grover was sort of forgotten. Incidentally, Grover spent just $842 in his primary race. Contrast that with the millions that are spent today. This 1948 primary was in the news a couple of years ago when Attorney General Pat Lautenberg lost her race to Kathleen Falk, and it was mentioned in the media that a sitting Attorney General hadn't lost a primary since Grover Broadfoot was defeated in 1948. Soon after the election in November 1948, Governor Rennebaum appointed Grover Broadfoot to a seat on the state Supreme Court. And that might have been maybe a consolation prize for putting him in the Attorney General's mess. But he appointed him to the state Supreme Court. Yeah, it was, as I mentioned earlier, it was the seat held by Grover's friend Elmer Barlow, who had died that previous June. On the court, Grover Broadfoot often played the role of a peacemaker between the justices. On the court, in talking to Gary Schlockstein, he spoke about the court was a more collegial body than it is today, and that Grover Broadfoot was the essence of that type of court. And it's a lot different now, where a few years ago, they actually had to have a counselor brought into the Supreme Court because the justices weren't getting along with each other. I can't imagine that happening with Grover Broadfoot. According to Judge Schlockstein, former Chief Justice George Curry told him that in court deliberations, Grover Broadfoot kept the discussions on track. And if things got contentions and tension was building, he would just tell some story about small town life, probably about some character here in Mondovi, that somehow related to the case, and that would help to relieve the tension, and they could go on and with their deliberations. Broadfoot was a consensus builder. His philosophy can be summed up in advice he gave to Gary Schlockstein when Gary became a judge. He said, "Gary, this job is not all that difficult. Just listen carefully and think to yourself how this case should come out. Then look at the law. Usually the law and what you think should agree. If not, read more law and you will find out what is right." Here's one picture of one of the early courts. It's from 49 to 51, and Grover Broadfoot is the second person on the right. Over the course of his tenure on the court, Broadfoot wrote many opinions. There's hundreds of them. One of the more notable opinions he wrote was the court's decision in Coaches versus Doctors Hospital. In that case, the court ruled that charitable organizations were not immune to lawsuits due to the negligence of its employees. Until this case was brought before the court, people had no recourse if something went wrong while they were in a hospital that was either owned by a church or a similar organization. He noted in his opinion that hospitals have changed over the years and that they are now larger in size, better endowed, and on a more sound economic basis. Insurance covering their liabilities available, and prudent management would dictate that such protection be purchased. In another case, he wrote the opinion involving African Americans being denied state life insurance. In his opinion, he wrote that the law required the Commissioner of Insurance to treat all residents of Wisconsin alike. In a case involving the union's right to strike against public utilities, Broadfoot's humor shone through when he wrote that counsel for the defendant ably advanced several persuasive arguments in support of contentions. They might be convincing if the rights of the public and the outcome of the litigation are overlooked. Broadfoot believed that the law should accord with common sense, and that view was reflected in the opinions he wrote for the court. Having been appointed to the court in 1948, Broadfoot ran for election in 1952 for the remaining years of that term. He had to wait that long because only one justice could be up for election in any given year, and there were several ahead of him. So he had to wait till 1952. According to news accounts, he spent just $1,184 on his campaign. And here's an example of where some of that money went. And again, that's quite a contrast to the millions of dollars given actually the last election he went through with all the TV advertising and the negativeness, and a lot different to back then. He went on to be elected to a full 10-year term in 1955, and that year he had no opposition. Throughout his years in Madison, Grover Broadfoot always maintained his ties to Mondovi. Each summer while he was on the court, he brought the court with him to the annual meeting of the Tri-County Bar Association, and thus provided local lawyers the opportunity to interact with the justices. The Broadfoots also kept their house here in Mondovi. They rented it out but kept a room for themselves so they would have a place to stay while they were in town. And Don Armstrong's here tonight, and they actually had rented the house during most of those years. And they went down in the 1950s, 52 to 60, so during those years. According to Roy Lee's old-timer report, the Broadfoots often could be seen eating breakfast at one of the local cafes on a Saturday morning, and then they'd visit with their many friends downtown. They probably came up for the monthly board meeting at the state bank where Grover was the president. And Alice Lee at the bank recalls that during the board meetings, Mrs. Broadfoot would sit by the drinking fountain in the bank waiting for the meeting to end and waiting for Grover. According to John Broadfoot, one aspect of Grover's life that most people were not aware of was that he was a diabetic. Diagnosed in 1933, he gave himself insulin shots daily, and that's a little different. In those days, needles were not disposable, so they were reusable, and Grover had his own set, and he would have to sharpen them himself periodically. Over the years, scar tissue had built up where he injected himself, so when he was able to do it, Mrs. Broadfoot would have to give him shots where he couldn't reach himself. In the fall of 1961, he was actually in the hospital, and it was an attempt to wean him from the insulin injections in favor of an oral medicine. And while he was in the hospital, he spoke with Margaret Broadfoot on the phone. And right after their conversation, Margaret passed away. When she was found, the phone was still in her hand. In January 1962, Grover Broadfoot became Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. He succeeded John Martin, who's actually in the center of the picture there, and that was also who he succeeded as Attorney General as well. He wasn't in the job long, however. He fell ill on May 3rd and passed away on May 18th. On Broadfoot's death, Justice George Curry commented that he was one of the most beloved men who ever sat on our court. Grover Broadfoot's funeral was held on May 23rd, 1962 at the Congregational Church in Mondovi. His pallbearers were John Ollie Ward, Charles Vincent, Binks Noggle, Ed Larkin, John Berg, and George Roberts. And Ed Larkin actually was there as the official representative of Governor Nelson, Gaylord Nelson. And Grover was buried next to his wife in Oak Park Cemetery. That's a very hard grave to find. It's a flat one right on the ground. It took me a whole day of walking that cemetery to find that. I suppose I could ask the city on the actual lot, but it was more fun walking through the cemetery. But I think that's in keeping with the modesty that Grover Broadfoot had too, that there isn't a big, huge monument to him. In closing, I would like to read an editorial that was published in the May 24th, 1962 edition of the Appleton Post-Crescent that I think really captures who Grover Broadfoot was. The passing of Grover L. Broadfoot, a man who spent all his adult life in public affairs and rose to be Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, probably marks the ending of an era in Wisconsin public life. Grover Broadfoot was a country lawyer and a politician of the kind that is not likely to rise again to the pinnacle of the judiciary in this rapidly changing and growing state. Every other judge of the present Wisconsin court, for example, has a thoroughly urban background. Judge Broadfoot regarded the little town of Mondovi in the far western part of Wisconsin as his home. And although he had been in Madison for many years, he kept his law office open there as he had during the earlier years of his life, and he kept title to his old home. It is perhaps not improper or disrespectful to relate that some of the other judges of the state court, in the cloistered privacy of their chambers in the quiet judicial wing of the Capitol, valued Judge Broadfoot's counsel and experience, aside from his qualities as a professional student of the law, precisely because of the richness of his experiences in rural and small town life. Controversies that run the gamut of human fallibility come to the state tribunal. Who in the court would feel competent to make a judgment as something as esoteric as town board psychology, or even the operations of a rural county board? The infinite complexities in the financing of livestock sales and farm machinery and the rest, except for Grover Broadfoot, who had dealt with them for half of his adult life as a village lawyer. The small town lawyer is not only a technical advisor, he is friend and confidant to his clientele. He is a leader by definition. The city lawyer is often by necessity, if not by choice, confined in his office. The country lawyer is a contributing part of the vibrant life of his main street, a man who is loved and trusted, not so much for the prestige of his law school, as for his humanity and his wisdom and his understandings of the foibles of his fellows. Such a man was Chief Justice Broadfoot, and the Supreme Court, we regretfully surmise, is not likely to see his kind again. And that's it. And now I'd like to turn it over to Randy Moore. He has some thoughts to share with us about Grover Broadfoot.
Good evening. Can you hear me without the microphone? I get echoes in my hearing. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have some physical infirmities tonight, but I wouldn't miss this for anything. When I first came to Mondovi in, 49, as a young lawyer out of law school, I had 2 kids, a wife, no job, no house to live in, and certainly no office. So I was looking around town and I saw that the Mondovi State Bank down here had an empty room. The PCA had just moved on. So I walked into the office of the bank there and I said, I see that it's empty. Do you mind if I rent it? Oh, no. Dr. Creer, he's upstairs. He's a dentist. And he might want to move down there. So we're holding that open for him. So, well, they better go up and talk to Dr. Creer. And I did. Oh, he said, Randy, I'd never go down there. I'm too old. There's no reason for me to go down there. So I went down to the officers of the bank, and that would mean the people that are in the bank. And I said, he's not gonna come down. Oh, he might change his mind, and then we're gonna keep this open for him. Well, it's lucky, I went and joined the Congregational Church in Moldova. Chris Gronger, who was a man with a lot of the good sense of Grover Broadfoot, was in that church. Grover Broadfoot was in that church. So I was talking one Sunday with Chris Gronger. He said, Randy, I understand that you're trying to get in that bank office down there. I said, yeah, but I'm not making it. He said, I'm on the board of the bank, but I don't really have any, power. Why don't you go down and see Grover Broadfoot? You know him? No, I never heard of him. Well, he's on the Supreme Court. And not only that, he's the president of the Moldova State Bank. Well, it's got a ways to go from Moldova down to the Supreme Court, but I thought I better get at it. So I went down there. In doing so, I committed a faux pas. As a young lawyer out of law school, I thought I knew everything, but there were 2 things I didn't know. One of them was that the justices down there had a rule that when lawyers come and argue cases, and they knew somebody, on the bench, you couldn't take them out to eat, anything like that, because it would give an impression of impropriety. And so you weren't supposed to do that, because if somebody saw you from the other side of your case, they'd think, boy, they're not going to win this case. But anyway, I still went in to the clerk of the state Supreme Court, and I said, I'm from Moldova, and Grover Broadfoot is from Moldova, and I need to see him. Well, she ushered me right into his office. I introduced myself. I said, I'm a young lawyer. I just come out of law school, and I see the Moldova State Bank has got that office, but they won't let me in it. Whoa. No. He said, you go back to Moldova, and by the time you get there, you move right in. And he said, the rent's going to be $25 a month in advance, and we'll take care of the lights and the heat. Well, that didn't sound bad to me. So I come in. I didn't even have money to buy a shingle to put up so nobody knew I was sitting in there. But it was getting ready for income tax time. And I found out that most of the lawyers at that time did income tax. So I got a white sheet of paper and put on it, income tax preparer. And I stuck it in the window of the Moldova State Bank in my office. Well, Grove always said, being down here in the Supreme Court is the loneliest thing you could ever do. Why? Because you can't talk to your friends and stuff like that. So he would come home on weekends, usually on a Saturday, and I'm sitting in the office here waiting for my first client after meetings that are going well. And in walks Grover Broadfoot. And he got a fellow by his hand, and he brings him in, and he said, this is Victor Stinky. He's from out here in the town of Naples, I think. And I've done his income tax returns for years, but now that I'm on the bench, I can't do that anymore. So Mr. Stinky, if you'd just leave your books here and then go on home, I'll help Mr. Morey get acquainted with your fiscal. So we did. Well, then Grove said, you take a legal pad, and at the top you put column headings. Insurance, repairs, supplies, blah, blah, blah. He read off from the feller's book all the numbers I was supposed to put in the proper column. And then he said, okay, get your adding machine and add them up. I said, Justice Grove Broadfoot, I don't have any. He said, that's okay, you take this sheet and I'll take this one. And we added them up in our heads over. Then he said, okay, Mr. Murray, now you put them on the income tax return. I said, you know, I've never had enough income to have to file a return. And in fact, I have never even seen an income tax form. That's okay. I'll show you where to put the numbers. And I figured out the tax. He said, now you call Mr. Stinky in after you've made copies. Do you know that Victor Stinky, who died in my career, stayed with me as a client all through my practice of law. He was a good man. He was one of our solid farmers. And his son, he stayed with me as a lawyer. I'm sitting in my office the next Saturday morning, reading law again, because there's nobody coming in. Here comes Go Broadfoot again. I think it was Arnold Tolley that he had by my hand. He said, I've done his income tax returns for years, and Mr. Tolley, you leave your books here, and you're going home and blah, 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 and through other things. Same procedure. I still didn't have an adding machine, but go work it out. I got to think, you know, to have a Supreme Court justice take time out to do that with me invigorates me and gives me a enthusiasm for someday there's going to be a young lawyer that I'm going to know, and I'm going to pass on this type of experience to that person. Well, wouldn't you know, after I got through, I knew something as a lawyer. A woman from southern part of the county who was a lawyer had been advertising. Before that, none of us could advertise. It was against the law. Well, she advertised, and of course, young lawyers did that because it brought in some business. We older lawyers didn't do that. We didn't think it was quite proper. But anyway, she calls me and says, I have 5 personal injury cases that I need to talk over with somebody. I just bring them up. So she brought them up. She opened the first one, and I looked through it. I said, you're going to learn a new legal term. What's that? I said, dog. We lawyers call cases that aren't worth taking a dog. And this is a dog. Go to file number 2. I'm proud to report to you that you have 2 pets. All 5 of those files were dogs. But I told her, I said, you can't afford to get involved in these. Your client's going to be mad at you whether you win or lose because there's not enough money involved. The best advice I can give to you, take these files home, call a client in, tell them what I just told you, and whatever the insurance company offers, take it and throw the file away. Well, there came a time when Grove became Supreme Court Justice. And those of us that knew him were real proud of that. And so he finally became Chief Justice. And all lawyers and judges around, we all went down to a party or a swearing-in thing, you know, for him. And some of the good lawyers, I wasn't a good lawyer then, gave a little talk right in the Supreme Court where who was sitting, you know, and they told about what a good guy he was. Well, Grove was the type of person who was humble. And he said, you know, fellas, if any of you want to be on the Supreme Court and become the Chief Justice, you know all you got to do? Live long enough. He said, that's the only thing. I'm older than all these other fellas, and so I'm the Chief Justice now. Well, then he had to thank the fellas that gave a little talk, you know, telling how good he was. And he says, honey's always better than vinegar. That's all he said, honey is better than vinegar. Well, then Grove died. And because he was a member of the church, the Movie Congregational Church, he was going to be buried through that church. So they announced a date and they're going to have his funeral. They had all the lawyers and judges around and friends and neighbors and whatever went to the Congregational Church. That wasn't a big church, but it wasn't real small either. That church was so plump full you could hardly breathe. Well, that was the good part. There's a bad part of that too. The Congregational Church had just hired a new minister. He was right out of seminary, and it turned out later he was a good minister, but he sure committed a faux pas at Grover's funeral. And everybody knew it except him. He had determined that in his ministry he was going to be Christ-like, and he meant that. And that meant that if you had somebody doing something wrong, you charged right into them and try to get it straightened out. What better opportunity does a young minister have when you've got the Supreme Court there and the judges and all these people than to take on some cause? He really didn't like lawyers. He didn't like divorces. And I can't remember the exact words he used, but it was something to the effect that these days I understand what's happening is that the lawyers are all creating divorces and keeping them going and using them to make money. You could hear a groan go through all of the justices of the Supreme Court and the lawyers. It was awful. What he didn't know was, of all the examples to use for a dissertation like that, Grove was not the appropriate one to use. We lawyers had a kind of a joke. I don't know if it started before that or after that, but it went something like this. There's a lawyer over in Menominee, he's now dead, and he gets a lot of divorces. And of course, when they involve people around Monrovia, Broadfoot ended up with a lot. And we asked the question, well, what did the lawyer from Menominee get paid? Well, he usually ended up with a farm. What about Grove? There's not much left for him. Oh, he charged $200. Of course, it was on a note.
Does anybody else have anything? Any family members want to add anything?
I have a small town lawyer story to tell. Back in the 80s, I was summoned by my father to come down to Monrovia and fetch my grandfather's desk out of, I think, maybe the state bank. Been in his old office since he'd been dead for 20 years or so. That was a huge thing. Couldn't make it out the door, that's why it still was there. It came apart fairly easy. Taking it home and reassembling it, I found a letter in there. And it's typical for a small-time lawyer, I think. It was a letter about a dispute between two brothers over a quarter. One brother borrowed a quarter from his other brother, didn't pay it back. His other brother wanted it back and was threatening bodily harm if he didn't get his quarter back. So the guy that owed the quarter went to Grover for protection, basically. So Grover wrote this letter, it slipped back in the desk under the typing pad there, and for probably 40 years sat there. The letter basically was Grover trying to be peacemaker between these two brothers and telling the one brother if he didn't cease and desist threats of bodily harm, he'd have to resort to legal action for a quarter.
Anybody else? Donna, do you have anything? Did you?
I know that I was going to be asked to do this. Yeah. In 1952, my husband and I were married, and of course we didn't know where we were going to live. And Blanche Fisher was a friend of the Broadfoots, and that was also my husband's aunt. And through her, they asked us if we'd like to live in their house. And of course, I was kind of apprehensive about it because I thought, oh, I won't be able to take care of it good enough for her. But it all worked out fine, and they only charged us $35 a month to live there. We paid our own utilities, of course. And they came once a month. At the end of the month, they would come, and he would, you know, he was the president of the bank, so he would go to the bank meeting. And they'd also bring her mother, Mrs. Jacoby, with them because she wasn't able to stay alone anymore. And they had 2 rooms upstairs, which they used when they came. And there was another bedroom up there, 3 bedrooms up there, and that other one we could use as a guest room. And we all lived there happily for 8 years and never had any problems. And I have a lot of respect for the family and pleasant memories of the association that I had with the Broadfoots. Thank you.
Anybody else?
I remember being at the recognition banquet that they had, and for Grover, and it also was a little bit of a roast. And Charlie Vinson was in charge, or MC of the program. And of course, everybody, as far as I know, that Grover Broadfoot never was much of a singer. And so Charlie made the comment that Grover's 2 favorite songs were The Star Spangled Banner and How Dry I Am. and you know, the thing that stuck with me was, you know, normally he'd really have to laugh about that. You know, wouldn't you think so? He had a stone face, a little bit of a pleasant smile, but he wouldn't give Charlie Vinson the satisfaction of thinking that he got one over on him. So I always remember that incident.
Anybody else? I should point out we do have some things you maybe saw on the table back there, just some news articles, and one of the special things we brought up from our Historic Society room is Grover Broadfoot's father's surgery kit. Yeah, so you might want to take a look at that, and some other articles and things that are on there. Something that I brought from home. It's always nice having a family that doesn't throw anything away. We found a phone book from my grandparents from 1961, and they list, you know, special phone numbers, and Roy Broadfoot's name was listed there as late as 61, so he must have still been doing some law work for people around here. So, and we lived a block down from the Congregational Church, and I've asked my mom, did you look out the window and see all the cars? And she said no. So, anyway. Thank you all for coming tonight, and that's the program.